Do you struggle sewing your buttonholes? I'm going to show you some tips on how to create perfect buttonholes every time. The first step is going to be getting the correct length of buttonhole. And so the way that I do this is following the instructions of the pattern. That's going to show you the placement of your button, but I simply use my vanishing pen, and you want your buttonhole to be a few millimeters larger than the actual button, because a small buttonhole is going to rip and distort, and a buttonhole that's too large is going to make your projects look kind of sloppy. I place my button where it's indicated on the pattern, and with my vanishing pen, I make a mark a couple millimeters beyond the top of the button, and then a couple millimeters on the other side of the button. Remove the button, and then I take my ruler, I draw a line to connect those two marks, and then perpendicular lines, because that's going to be what I'm using visually when I'm stitching the buttonhole at my machine. And if you follow those steps, you're going to get a perfect buttonhole. You want to make sure you look at the fabric that you're using when you're making a buttonhole, because just like when you're sewing any project, the type of fabric is going to determine some needles or thread that you're going to use. And you also want to use stabilizer, and that's especially true when you're working with different types of fabrics. So for instance, this like sheer chiffon fabric, my buttonhole turned out really well because I used a stabilizer on the inside. So it's a fusible stabilizer that I put on the wrong side of my project of the chiffon, and then that helps the buttonhole move, because if you're imagining, the feed dogs are going to be pulling the underside of your project at a different rate than the top side, and when you're working with a different type of fabric that's slinky or silky, those move differently, the top layer and the bottom layer, and so stabilizer is your friend when you're working on a buttonhole. And the same is true when you're working with a stretch fabric. Here I have a nice buttonhole in this jersey because I applied stabilizer, which you can't see here, but on this color, you could see my jersey is very stretchy. This is a 4-way knit, but with the stabilizer attached, there's no stretch. So when this gets folded and I'm going to be working on a buttonhole on this project, it's not going to be stretching and moving. It's going to give me a really nice buttonhole. So stabilizer is the way to go when working with buttonholes. All right, so here are a couple of different buttonhole feet. This one is my Bernina buttonhole foot, and I really love it. It's a 4-step buttonhole. The great thing about this is I do one buttonhole and then it memorizes it, and then each of my buttonholes will be the exact same size. So I only have to do that measuring step one time, and then this will follow my instructions. This one is from our Baby Lock, and it indicates the size of the button and helps you by actually placing the button in the buttonhole foot. And then there's also, some machines have this fancy one-step auto system, and if you have that on your machine, most of these steps you won't have to worry about as far as measuring goes. Now, every brand of machine is a little bit different, so I highly recommend that you read that manual. So if you're still struggling with your buttonhole and you have applied stabilizer and it's still not working, and you're getting something on the backside that looks like this, you may need to be adjusting your machine settings. And so think about the tension, the presser foot tension setting, and also the fabric. Again, I want to make sure that you're using the correct needle and thread for the project that you're working on. Very important with buttonholes. So the popular method of cutting a buttonhole is with your good old seam ripper, and it's a great method. A little tip that I want to give you though, if you're going to do it with this way, is to put a pin right at the top of the buttonhole so that you don't go too far. Like if you're like using a lot of muscle and you punch all the way through that, you're gonna rip the stitches of your buttonhole. And so you take your seam ripper and you pop it into the button and you go all the way up to the pin. And that's gonna prevent you from going all the way through, because ask me how I know, I've done it and it messes up your buttonhole. But I also like to use my really sharp embroidery scissors. I'll punch the hole first with my seam ripper and then snip it with these nice little scissors, and that gives me a much better finish every time. So that's how you're going to cut the hole through the buttonhole. So if you're still struggling with your buttonholes, I recommend that it might be time to get your machine serviced, because it's not always user error. It could be your machine. And another tip, always practice on similar fabric or the same fabric scrap of the project you're working on, because you're going to get the best results if you practice on the same fabric. I know buttonholes can be tricky, but with a little practice and some patience, you've got this. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and if there are other tips and tricks that you'd like to learn, let us know in the comments below. Happy sewing!